October 1944. The Philippine Sea is restless, streaked with smoke and spray. A destroyer cuts hard through the water, engines driving her bow into oncoming waves as alarms echo across steel decks. This is USS Heermann, a Fletcher-class destroyer, fighting not a surface enemy, but the sky. Radar contacts multiply. Aircraft descend fast and low. The attacks are deliberate. One after another, Japanese planes angle in, engines screaming, wings steady. Kamikazes, anti-aircraft guns, thunder. Tracers claw upward. Then, without warning, part of the ship goes blind. A director falters. Guns hesitate. Somewhere inside the hull, a cable has been severed by shock, by shrapnel, by the violence of maneuver. The ship is still moving. The attackers are still coming. Far below the gun mounts and bridge, a sailor who does not man a weapon leaves his station. He is a cook by rating. His hands are trained for knives and burners, not circuits and fire control lines. But he knows one thing clearly: if the cable stays dead, the guns stay silent, with aircraft diving in and the ship shuddering under fire. He crawls into the passageway where the damage lies, carrying what he can find. No order reaches him. No instruction follows. There is only time measured in seconds, and a fix that must work now. To understand how this moment unfolded, and why it mattered against an attack of overwhelming force, we must step back to the ship itself, how it fought, how it survived, and why every sailor aboard mattered. To understand why a single severed cable could decide the fate of USS Heermann, it is necessary to understand what kind of ship she wasn't, what she was never meant to endure. USS Heermann was a Fletcher-class destroyer, built for speed, aggression, and flexibility. At just over 2,100 tons, she was designed to screen larger ships, hunt submarines, launch torpedoes, and fight aircraft, all while maneuvering violently in close quarters. She was not armored. She survived by seeing first, firing first, and staying alive through motion. By 1944, destroyers like Heermann had become the nervous system of the U.S. Navy. Radar sets fed data to fire control directors. Directors fed gun mounts through electrical and mechanical cabling. Power ran through narrow trunks along passageways never meant to absorb damage. Every weapon depended on electricity. Every system depended on continuity. When everything worked, the ship fought as a single organism. When something failed, it failed fast. Fire control cables were especially vulnerable. They ran through bulkheads, overheads, and cableways that could be crushed by shock alone. No direct hit required. A near miss could snap insulation, short connections, or tear mounts loose. The result was not gradual degradation, but sudden blindness. This mattered most against air attack. A kamikaze strike did not need to destroy a ship outright. It needed only to suppress her defenses long enough for the next aircraft to get through. Japanese pilots understood this. They aimed not just at decks and superstructures, but at directors, masts, and exposed equipment. Understood it too. U.S. Navy damage control training drilled one principle relentlessly. Any sailor could be a damage control sailor. Ratings mattered less than initiative. Men were trained to isolate systems, rig bypasses, and restore function using whatever materials were at hand. Formal repair could wait. Survival could not. This philosophy was born of experience. In earlier battles from Guadalcanal to the Solomons, ships were lost, not because they were hit, but because damage spread unchecked. Fire burned, power died, control was lost. Those lessons reshaped how ships fought in 1944. By the time Heermann entered the waters off Leyte, every sailor aboard understood that survival depended on more than guns and courage. It depended on speed of reaction inside the hull, on whether broken systems could be made to work again before the next blow landed, and the blows were coming down. In Sopi 1944, Japan introduced a tactic that ignored traditional measures of damage and deterrence. Kamikaze attacks were not meant to duel ships. They were meant to overwhelm them physically, psychologically, and systemically. Destroyers like Heermann, fast and lightly protected, were both the shield and the target. They stood between incoming aircraft and the carriers, battleships, and transports behind them. They maneuvered violently to throw off aim. They fired until barrels glowed, and when something inside the ship failed, there was no time to ask who was supposed to fix it, because in the next moments, measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats, sky would fill again, and whether Heermann lived or died would depend on whether one broken link could be restored in time. That reality shaped everything that followed, especially the nature of the enemy now descending from above and why their method of attack made even the smallest failure catastrophic. By October 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase Japan's planners had long feared and reluctantly prepared for. The loss of air superiority was no longer temporary. Carrier aviation had been shattered earlier in the year. Trained pilots were gone. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft production could not match American output. Faced with these realities, Japanese command adopted a doctrine that abandoned survival as a requirement. It was called TOC Special. Attack kamikaze operations were not random acts of desperation. They were structured, rehearsed, and targeted. Pilots were trained to ignore defensive fire, hold course, and aim for specific ship types. The objective was not simply to hit a ship, but to disable her ability to defend others. Destroyers were prime targets. They formed the outer screen. They carried radar. They controlled anti-aircraft fire. They maneuvered constantly, drawing attackers away from carriers and transports. A disabled destroyer opened gaps in the defensive perimeter that could be exploited immediately. Japanese pilots understood this geometry. A kamikaze did not need to sink a destroyer. It needed to blind her knockout radar, sever fire control cables, or suppress gun directors. Once that happened, the ship's effectiveness dropped sharply. The next attacker would face fewer guns, slower reactions, and greater chance of impact. This created a brutal rhythm. One aircraft forced evasive maneuver. Another followed through the disrupted fire. A third arrived as the ship tried to recover balance. Attacks came in waves, not because pilots coordinated perfectly, but because saturation overwhelmed reaction time. For the men aboard American ships, this was unlike anything they had faced before. Traditional air attack allowed for disengagement. Pilots broke off. Bombers turned away. Kamikazes did neither. Once committed, they held course even through fire that would have deterred any rational attacker. This removed a key assumption from naval defense. American gunners had been trained to break attacks to force pilots off aim, to disrupt bombing. Runs kamikazes did not break. Guns now had to destroy, not deter, and destruction depended entirely on systems remaining functional. This made internal damage lethal. Shock from near misses rattled cable trunks. Shrapnel sliced insulation. Vibration loosened mounts. A ship might be untouched externally, yet crippled, internally blind, mute, and vulnerable in the middle of an attack sequence. In this environment, time compressed violently. A failed circuit was no longer a maintenance issue. It was an existential one. The difference between a gun firing now or 10 seconds later could be the difference between survival and impact. This is why U.S. Navy damage control doctrine emphasized decentralization. Officers could not direct every response. Specialists could not reach every failure. The system assumed that anyone would act. Sailors were taught where cables ran, how to rig power, how to improvise insulation and connections under fire. The doctrine was not elegant, it was ruthless, and it worked. When someone recognized the moment early enough, on USS Heermann, as kamikazes descended in numbers that defied earlier experience. That moment arrived when a severed cable began to silence guns that could not afford silence. The attackers were counting on that silence to last. They believed the window was open. What they did not anticipate was that the window would close not through command, not through design, but through a single improvised action carried out deep inside the ship by a sailor whose rating placed him far from the guns, but whose training placed him exactly where he was needed to understand how that action unfolded and why it worked. We must now look at the engagement through the angles that defined it: the people inside the ship, the systems that failed, and the tactics pressing in from the sky. Human angle: the sailor who was not supposed to be their warship assigns roles for order, not for crisis. Asterisk on USS Heermann, every sailor had a battle station, drilled until movement became reflex. Cooks belonged below decks. They fed the ship, kept men alive between actions, and stayed clear of exposed areas during combat. Their job ended when the general alarm sounded, but kamikaze warfare did not respect roles. As the first wave broke against the destroyer's screen, shock traveled through the hull in violent pulses. Somewhere amid that shock, a cable failed. The effect was immediate. A gun director hesitated. A mount failed to respond as it should. The ship did not go silent, but it became uncertain. Uncertainty is lethal at sea. The cook who noticed the change did not need a technical readout. He felt it. The rhythm of the ship changed. The sound of the guns altered. The cadence that meant protection faltered. Training had taught him one thing clearly. When something feels wrong in a combat ship, it probably is. He did not wait for instruction. Damage control. Doctrine had taught him where critical systems ran and what failure looked like. He knew that cables were vulnerable. He knew that if a line had been severed, the ship's guns were fighting with one hand tied. Leaving his station was not courage. 'Twas logic, technical angle. Why one cable could silence a ship destroyers did not rely on redundancy the way larger ships did. Space and weight were limited. Fire control systems were distributed but connected through narrow trunks of cabling that linked radar, directors, and gun mounts into a single fighting system. When intact, that system allowed rapid engagement. When interrupted, it collapsed with brutal speed. The cable that failed aboard Heermann was not exotic. It carried power and control signals between a director and one or more gun mounts. Severed by vibration or fragment impact, it caused hesitation, not a total blackout, but a delay that exposed the ship's defensive rhythm. That delay was what kamikaze pilots hunted. A gun that hesitated forced others to compensate. Compensation widened arcs. Widened arcs created approach lanes. Approach lanes invited commitment. The failure was small in isolation. In combat, it was catastrophic. Tactical angle. How kamikazes exploited hesitation. Kamikaze attack geometry was brutally simple. Aircraft approached low or steep, presenting minimal profile. They accepted damage. They held course. The only variable that mattered was timing. Whether the ship's guns could destroy them before impact. Japanese pilots watched gun behavior closely. A momentary lull told them where to aim. A delayed response marked a path. Once committed, they did not break off. They rode the window all the way in. The failed cable aboard Heermann opened such a window as the destroyer maneuvered violently to throw off aim. The attackers adjusted not to the ship's movement, but to its guns. Where fire lagged, they pressed harder. Where it thickened, they shifted. The ship was being read like a map. This is what made the situation irrecoverable through maneuver alone. Turning harder risked further shock damage. Slowing invited convergence. The only solution was restoration. That restoration would not come from the bridge. It would come from inside the hull, where someone had to locate the damage, isolate it, and re-establish continuity while the ship shook. Lights flickered. An aircraft screamed in. These three angles: human instinct, technical fragility, and enemy exploitation converged into a narrow window where survival depended on whether the ship could close the gap faster than the attackers could reach it. That window did not stay open long, because while kamikazes descended in numbers that defied earlier experience, one sailor was already moving through smoke and steel toward the severed line, carrying no orders, no authority, and only the simplest of tools. What he did next would determine whether Heermann remained a fighting. Ship horror became the opening the enemy needed. Improvisation. Angle the fix that was never meant to exist. The passageway was narrow, low, and already cluttered with the residue of battle condensation shaken loose by shock. Paint dust drifting in the air, the smell of hot insulation. The cook did not approach the problem as a technician. He approached it as a sailor trained. To keep a ship alive, he found the break quickly. A cable bundle had been torn loose from its clamps. Insulation split where it had been slammed against a bulkhead. The line was not destroyed, only separated enough to interrupt signal continuity and introduce delay. In peacetime, this would have required isolation, Replacement. Testing. There was no peacetime here. Using what he had, simple hand tools. Insulating materials scavenged from nearby, and the clamps themselves, he forced the line back into contact. The repair was crude. It ignored neatness and long-term reliability. It did one thing only. It closed the circuit. The moment continuity was restored, the system did not become perfect. It became alive again. Signals flowed. Response returned. The guns did not know the difference between elegance and survival. This was not invention. It was substitution, trading precision for immediacy. The fix was never meant to last. It was meant to hold for minutes. That was enough. Enemy angle. What the kamikazes expected to happen. Japanese kamikaze doctrine relied on a grim certainty. Once a ship's defenses faltered, they would not recover in time. Damage would accumulate faster than repairs could be made. Crews would be overwhelmed. Guns would fall silent one by one. The final attacker would meet only scattered fire. That expectation was rational. In most navies, systems failed progressively. Repairs took time. Authority flowed downward. Initiative was constrained by role. Kamikaze pilots were trained to exploit that delicate once hesitation appeared and ride it to impact. A destroyer like USS Heermann should have followed that pattern. Instead, the pattern broke as pilots committed to attack runs based on observed hesitation. The ship's fire thickened unexpectedly. Arcs closed where gaps should have widened. Timing collapsed. The attackers had already accepted risk, but not this kind. They had expected a dying system. They encountered a recovering one. This mismatch between expectation and reality was fatal. Kamikaze attacks depended on certainty more than maneuver. When certainty vanished, the attack geometry unraveled. Systems angle. Why restoring one link saved the whole ship complex. Combat systems do not fail evenly. They fail at points of stress. Then cascade. Single severed cable aboard Heermann had begun such a cascade. Fire control hesitation forced manual compensation. Manual compensation increased crew workload. Increased workload slowed response. Slower response widened attack windows. The improvised fix interrupted that cascade at its origin. By restoring continuity at one point, the cook returned the system to a state where it could function as designed, if imperfectly. Directors could feed mounts. Mounts could track targets. Gunners could rely on what they saw. This restored something more important than power. It restored rhythm. Naval anti-aircraft defense depended on rhythm-predictable cycles of detection, tracking, firing, correction. When that rhythm held, attackers were destroyed at range. When it faltered, ships died as the cable held. Heermann's rhythm returned. Kamikazes that had already committed flew into a defensive pattern they no longer understood. Some were destroyed outright. Others were forced off course by damage they could not overcome. Still, others lost timing entirely and missed the ship they had aimed for. Accounts from the action would later credit Heermann with helping defeat a massive wave of attackers, often cited as 27 aircraft either destroyed or driven off during the engagement. Attribution in such battles was always complex, shared among ships and overlapping fire. What matters is this. Heermann did not become a hole in the screen. She remained a barrier. The improvised repair did not make headlines. It did not alter ship design. It did not become doctrine. But it closed a window at the exact moment the enemy depended on it remaining open in modern naval warfare. That is often the difference between survival and loss. These angles: improvisation under fire, enemy miscalculation, and system recovery converged into a single turning point. The ship's fate pivoted not on armor or tonnage, but on whether a severed cable could be made whole again before the next aircraft arrived. The next moments would decide whether that fragile continuity held long enough to matter, because the sky was not done yet. The attack did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived as pressure. On USS Heermann, bridge tracked multiple inbound aircraft at once. Bearings overlapped. Altitudes collapsed. The sky ahead of the destroyer seemed to thicken as silhouettes tipped forward and began their dives. The ship heeled hard to port, then starboard. Engines surged. Rudder orders came fast. The intent was simple: spoil aim, force last second. Corrections: buy time for the guns. But time was thinning. The damaged circuit had already begun to matter. A director hesitated again, not fully dead, but slow enough to desynchronize fire. One mount fired early. Another lagged. The rhythm that kept aircraft at distance started to fray. The kamikazes sensed it. Two attackers committed almost together. One high and steep, the other low and fast. Tracers stitched the air, but the pattern was uneven. The high attacker held course longer than expected. The low one skimmed through spray and smoke, closing rapidly. Inside the ship. The cook reached the cableway as shock rippled through the bulkheads. He could hear the guns above him, and even now, strained. He did not know how many aircraft were coming. He did not need to. He knew only that hesitation meant impact. He forced the connection tighter. The action was crude. The ship lurched as he worked. Insulation tore further. The cable was bent into place and held there by pressure and clamp rather than design. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the guns answered. The director snapped back into response. The delayed mount caught up. Fire converged where it had not moments earlier. The high attacker disintegrated under concentrated bursts. The low aircraft staggered, clipped by fire, and veered off, missing the ship by yards before plunging into the sea. There was no pause. Another wave pressed in. Now the difference was visible. The ship's fire no longer wandered. Tracers formed dense curtains instead of scattered lines. Attackers began taking damage earlier in their dives. Forced into evasive corrections, they could not. The destroyer held its place in the screen. This was the pivot. The kamikazes had counted on compounding, failure on each second of hesitation, widening into a permanent gap. Instead, the gap closed abruptly, turning commitment into catastrophe. On the bridge, the reports changed tone. Director responding, mount tracking, target breaking up. Below decks, the cook stayed, where he was bracing the cable with his body when the ship shuddered, knowing that if it came loose again, there would be no second chance. Above him, the sky burned. The engagement was no longer a collapse. It was a fight, and for the first time since the wave began, Heermann was not reacting. She was denying, but the attack was not finished yet. More aircraft were still inbound, some already committed, others circling for their moment. Whether the improvised fix would hold long enough, and whether the destroyer could survive the full weight of what was coming would be decided in the next brutal minutes. The difference after the repair was not subtle, as the next kamikazes tipped into their dives. USS Heermann met them with a wall of fire that no longer wavered. Directors tracked cleanly. Mounts responded instantly. The ship's anti-aircraft rhythm, lost only minutes before, had returned. The attackers felt it immediately. Aircraft that should have reached terminal approach began shedding pieces at range. Wings tore loose. Engines flamed out. Some pilots tried to correct, but the correction came too late. The sky filled with falling debris, streaks of smoke tracing arcs that never reached the deck. The destroyer continued to maneuver. But now, each turn was deliberate rather than desperate. Rudder orders were measured. Speed held steady. The ship no longer fled the attack geometry. It imposed one. Kamikaze pilots who had expected collapsing defenses encountered a ship that refused to weaken. Several aircraft were destroyed outright by Heermann's guns. Others were damaged badly enough that they lost control or were forced to abort, crashing short or veering into the sea. Some were driven into the overlapping fire of neighboring ships, where they were finished. The wave unraveled. What had been a coordinated saturation attack devolved into isolated attempts, each one met by a defense that no longer hesitated. The attacker's greatest weapon certainty was gone. Below decks, the improvised cable held. The cook remained braced against it as shock after shock rippled through the hull. He did not watch the sky. He did not count aircraft. He listened to the guns. As long as they fired smoothly, he stayed where he was. Minutes stretched. Then, gradually, the noise changed. The thunder overhead softened. The intervals between bursts lengthened. Reports from the bridge confirmed what everyone felt but dared not say yet. The wave had passed. When the final aircraft disappeared from radar, Heermann was still afloat, still maneuvering, still fighting. She had not been hit by a kamikaze. Her guns remained operational. The screen held later tallies would attribute the defeat of up to 27 attacking aircraft to the combined fire of the destroyer screen during that phase of the battle with Heermann's. Restored defenses playing a critical role in denying attackers their opening. Exact numbers would always be debated. The reality was simpler. The ship survived a wave that should have overwhelmed her. Only then did the cook release the cable. The repair was never meant to last. Once the immediate danger passed, damage control parties arrived, isolated the circuit properly, and rigged a more stable bypass. The cook returned to his station without comment. No announcement was made. On the bridge, officers logged the engagement in measured language. Multiple inbound aircraft. Defensive fire, effective. No direct hits sustained. Systems temporarily impaired, then restored. What those words concealed was the truth known to everyone aboard. The ship had come within seconds of losing its ability to defend itself and, with it, the lives of the men aboard and the ships behind her. That outcome had been averted not by armor, not by design, but by a sailor acting decisively inside the hull while the sky tried to kill the ship. The climax of the battle did not arrive with a single explosion. It arrived with continuity restored, and as Heermann resumed her place in the screen, the meaning of what had just occurred began to settle not as celebration, but as understanding. The destroyer had held because one broken link had been closed in time. The consequences of that moment would unfold quietly, in damage reports, in memory, and in the legacy of how ships survived the kamikaze onslaught. When the sky finally emptied, the first sensation aboard USS Heermann was not relief. It was inventory. Damage control teams moved immediately, not waiting for confirmation that the danger had passed. Fires were checked, compartments were inspected, circuits were traced. Every space that had shaken, sparked, or gone briefly dark was examined with the understanding that the next attack might come before the last was fully understood. The ship had survived intact. There were scars, buckled fittings, scorched paint, loosened mounts, but no fatal wound. Most critically, the fire control system that had faltered during the attack was now stabilized through a proper bypass. What had been an improvised hold was replaced by a secure rerouting, tested and confirmed while the ship still maneuvered. With the formation, only then did the larger meaning of the moment emerge. The destroyer had faced a saturation attack designed to overwhelm not her hull, but her nervous system. The kamikazes had aimed to blind her, silence her guns, and turn her into an opening in the screen. That opening never appeared. In the official after-action reports, the language was restrained. Aircraft engaged, fire effective, multiple enemy planes destroyed or diverted, systems temporarily impaired, then restored. The phrasing reflected Navy culture, measured, technical, uninterested in embellishment. Nowhere did it say cook. Nowhere did it say improvised. Those words did not belong in reports meant to inform future operations through reproducible lessons. What happened aboard Heermann could not be turned into a checklist. It depended on circumstance, proximity, and judgment exercised under pressure. Yet the officers understood exactly what had occurred. So did the enlisted men. The ship's continued ability to fight had rested on one truth the Navy had learned the hard way throughout the war. Damage control was not a department, it was a condition. When it worked, ships lived. When it failed, ships vanished quickly and without ceremony. The engagement off Leyte reinforced that truth with brutal clarity. Destroyers across the fleet had been lost to kamikazes, not because they lacked courage or firepower, but because a single system failed at the wrong moment and could not be restored in time. Those ships did not sink slowly. They burned, rolled, and were gone. Heermann avoided that fate. She remained on station after the attack. Engine steady, guns manned, radar scanning. The screen did not have to close ranks around a hole. There was no hole top for the cook, who had made the repair. There was no formal recognition at that moment. The Navy did not celebrate improvisation in the midst of combat. Survival was its own validation. He returned to his duties quietly, just another sailor aboard a ship that had lived through something many others had not. As night fell and the sea calmed, the destroyer carried on, still vulnerable, still necessary, still standing between the enemy and the ships behind her. but survival is never the end of the story. What mattered next was how the lesson was absorbed not in official doctrine, but in the habits and expectations of crews who understood now more clearly than ever that the difference between life and loss could hinge on a single, restored connection. That understanding would shape how sailors fought the kamikaze threat in the months that followed. In the days that followed, USS Heermann remained at sea. There was no pause for reflection. The kamikaze threat did not recede with a single repelled wave. It returned again and again, each attack shaped by the same logic of saturation and sacrifice. What changed was not the enemy's method. It was the defender's awareness across the destroyer force. Crews spoke quietly about moments when systems failed and were brought back by hands not assigned to them. These were not stories shared for praise. They were shared as warnings. Know your ship. Know where power runs. Know what to do when the diagram stops helping. No directive captured this. The Navy could not formalize improvisation without courting disaster. Every ship was different. Every failure was unique. What could be taught was responsibility. And that lesson had already been learned. Damage control. Training intensified. Drills emphasized speed over perfection. Sailors were encouraged, without being told explicitly, to think in terms of restoration rather than diagnosis. Get it working now. Make it safe later. The kamikaze campaign forced this mindset. Ships struck later in the war often survived, not because they were untouched, but because they stayed functional long enough to deny attackers their window. Guns that came back online in seconds rather than minutes destroyed aircraft that would otherwise have hit. Radar restored in time redirected fire that saved neighboring ships. These outcomes rarely traced back to a single person in official histories. They were attributed to effective damage control or rapid system recovery. The language blurred individual action into institutional success. Yet the individuals remembered. They remembered crawling through smoke-filled passageways. They remembered forcing connections together with tools meant for other purposes. They remembered holding systems in place with their bodies while the ship shook around them. For Japanese pilots, the pattern was impossible to read. They continued to expect that once a ship faltered, it would remain vulnerable. Increasingly, that expectation failed. Destroyers that should have gone dark recovered. Guns that should have stayed silent resumed fire. The cost of commitment rose, but doctrine left no room to reconsider. By 1945, the kamikaze campaign was inflicting damage but not achieving decisive collapse. Ships like Heermann embodied why. They were not invulnerable. They were adaptive. The destroyer's survival did not change the course of the war, but it preserved the integrity of the screen at a moment when collapse could have cascaded through the fleet. It denied the enemy the psychological and tactical payoff their strategy required in post-war analysis. The emphasis fell on number sorties flown, ships damaged, aircraft lost. The quieter mechanisms of survival went largely unexamined. Yet those mechanisms mattered deeply in aggregate. Modern naval doctrine would later formalize redundancy, compartmentalization, and automated rerouting. But in 1944, those concepts were still being learned through experience and often through pain. The lesson aboard Heermann was never written as an order. It became something more durable, a shared understanding that a ship is not only steel and weapons, but continuity. That when continuity breaks, it must be restored immediately by whoever is closest, with whatever works. That understanding traveled with sailors from ship to ship, watch to watch, long after the specific engagement faded from memory. And it prepared the ground for a final reflection, one that reaches beyond a single destroyer or a single sailor, into the nature of modern warfare itself. Modern war is often remembered through machines, through ships measured in tons, guns measured in caliber, and aircraft counted in waves. But the story of USS Heermann reveals something more fragile beneath that machinery, something far less predictable, and far more decisive: continuity. A warship does not fight because it is armed. It fights because its systems remain connected long enough to respond. Radar must speak to directors. Directors must speak to guns. Power must flow without hesitation. When that chain breaks, even the strongest ship becomes momentarily helpless. The kamikaze strategy understood this truth. Intuitively, it sought not elegance, but collapse. Not duel, but overload. It counted on the idea that once a ship faltered, it would continue to falter until destruction followed. What it underestimated was the human element inside those systems. The cook, who forced a severed cable back into contact, did not alter naval doctrine. He did not invent a new weapon. He restored continuity at the exact moment when continuity was all that mattered. In doing so, he denied the enemy the one thing their strategy required: certainty. This is how survival often works in modern warfare. Not through perfect systems, but through systems that can be rescued. Not through flawless execution, but through rapid recovery. The most advanced machines still fail. What determines the outcome is how quickly those failures are recognized, and whether someone is willing to act before procedure catches up with reality. USS Heermann lived through a moment that could not be planned for, and could not be repeated exactly. Yet that moment reflects a broader truth of the Pacific War. Fleets survived not only because they were powerful, but because they were adaptable. The Navy would later formalize redundancy and automation. But in 1944, redundancy often came in the form of a sailor who understood that his ship mattered more than his rating. And that hesitation was the most dangerous failure of all. The destroyer sailed on. The sky emptied, the cable held. And in that, quiet continuity restored, just in time. We see how wars are sometimes decided not by overwhelming force, but by one small connection made whole again while everything else is trying to come apart.